December 7th, 1941. 7:48 a.m. Over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led 183 aircraft in the first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor. His pilots flew with precision that would be studied in military academies for decades. Moving targets from altitude, coordinated attacks across multiple objectives, and executed complex maneuvers under combat stress. These were not novice pilots. They were among the most highly trained aviators in the world. Fuchida himself had logged over 3,000 flight hours. His wingmen averaged 800 hours each. The fighter pilots providing cover had trained for 3 years at the Kasumigara Naval Air Training Center. They could dogfight blindfolded, navigate by stars alone, and land on carriers in complete darkness. They represented the pinnacle of naval aviation. "Our pilots are samurai of the air," Admiral Yamamoto had declared in 1940. "Each one worth 10 of any enemy. We have created the finest naval air arm the world has ever seen." On December 7th, 1941, this wasn't propaganda, it was accurate assessment. The Imperial Japanese Navy's aviators were simply better trained than any potential opponent. But 3 years later, on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, something had changed catastrophically. American pilots would shoot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most lopsided aerial victory in naval history. What happened wasn't that Japanese pilots got worse, though they did. It was that American pilots got systematically, overwhelmingly better, while Japanese training collapsed under pressures Japan never anticipated. This is the story of how industrial-scale pilot production defeated artisan-quality training. How American flight schools graduating 30,000 pilots annually buried Japan's elite in an avalanche of competence. And how by 1945, Japanese pilots with 100 hours total flight time were dying on their first mission against Americans flying their 100th. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These weren't just adequate, they were exceptional by any standard. Japanese naval aviator training began at age 16 or 17. Candidates underwent brutal physical and academic screening. Of 1,500 applicants, perhaps 100 would be accepted. The program lasted 3 years, longer than most nations' entire military service requirements. At Kasumigara or Tsuchiura training centers, student pilots learned navigation, meteorology, aircraft mechanics, and military theory before ever touching an aircraft. When flight training began, it emphasized perfection over speed. Students who couldn't master basic maneuvers were eliminated without mercy. Graduation rates hovered around 40%. More students washed out than succeeded. Survivors received approximately 300 hours of flight training before operational assignment, then another 400 to 500 hours in their assigned squadrons before being considered combat ready. By the time a Japanese naval aviator flew his first combat mission, he had typically logged 700 to 800 flight hours and spent 3 to 4 years in training. The results spoke for themselves. Japanese pilots could launch from carriers in weather that grounded other nations' aircraft. They could navigate 800 miles over open ocean, attack targets, and return to moving carriers using only compass and clock. Their gunnery scores exceeded Western standards. Their aerobatic skills were legendary. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's most famous surviving ace with 64 kills, described the training culture. "We were taught that adequate was failure. Good was barely acceptable. Only perfection was satisfactory. I spent 2 years learning to fly before I ever saw combat. In that time, I flew every day, weather permitting. Navigation exercises of 6 hours. Gunnery practice until our hands blistered. Formation flying so tight our wingtips merely touched. This created pilots of extraordinary individual quality. But it was a system designed for a short war, or no war at all. Japan graduated approximately 100 to 150 naval aviators per year from 1937 to 1941. This was adequate for peacetime operations and sustainable losses. It was completely inadequate for war of attrition against an opponent who could produce pilots by the thousands. The United States entered the war with a modest but expandable pilot training infrastructure. The Army, Air Forces, and Navy each operated several flight training bases. Annual production in 1940 was approximately 300 military pilots total, pathetic compared to Japan. But American military planners understood something fundamental. Modern war would consume pilots faster than traditional training could replace them. They needed industrial-scale production of competent aviators, not artisan-scale production of perfect ones. In 1939, the civilian pilot training program began creating a pipeline of aviation-literate civilians. By Pearl Harbor, over 435,000 Americans had received basic flight instruction through civilian programs. This created a massive pool of candidates who already understood aviation basics before entering military training. The U.S. military expanded training capacity with stunning speed. New flight training bases appeared across the southern United States, taking advantage of year-round flying weather. By 1943, the training infrastructure included over 100 major facilities training pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners simultaneously. The training philosophy differed fundamentally from Japan's. American doctrine didn't demand perfection. It demanded competence at specific tasks, achieved quickly, then refined through operational experience. A U.S. Navy pilot candidate in 1943 underwent approximately 300 hours of formal flight training over 10 to 12 months, similar to Japan's program length. But the American program emphasized practical skills over theoretical perfection. Students learned adequate navigation, adequate gunnery, adequate carrier landings. Good enough was good enough if it got pilots operational quickly. Then came the crucial difference: operational training. After formal flight school, American pilots spent 4 to 6 months in operational training units, flying the specific aircraft they'd use in combat, practicing tactics with experienced instructors, and accumulating another 200, 300 hours before operational assignment. By the time an American pilot reached a combat squadron in 1943-44, he typically had 500 to 600 flight hours total, less than Japanese pilots in 1941, but far more than Japanese pilots would have by 1943. More importantly, American pilots continued training between combat missions. When squadrons rotated off the front lines, they drilled constantly. Gunnery practice, tactics development, formation flying, the learning never stopped. Lieutenant Alex Vrachu, who would become a top U.S. Navy ace with 19 kills, described his preparation. By the time I reached my squadron in 1943, I had over 500 hours in my logbook. But the real learning happened in the squadron. Our experienced pilots taught us things no training manual covered. We flew practice missions every day we went in combat. The Navy kept us sharp. The American system wasn't creating samurai, it was creating competent professionals in massive numbers. The first 6 months of the Pacific War suggested Japanese confidence was justified. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots performed flawlessly. In the Philippines, Japanese aviators destroyed American air power on the ground and in the air. Over the Java Sea, Japanese pilots dominated Dutch and British aircraft. The early carrier battles, Coral Sea in May 1942 and Midway in June 1942, showed Japanese pilot quality clearly. At Coral Sea, Japanese pilots sank the carrier USS Lexington despite heavy losses. Their attack coordination and accuracy remained superb. But Midway revealed the first cracks. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and, more critically, over 120 experienced pilots, roughly 10% of their total trained carrier aviator force. These weren't replaceable novices. These were the veteran pilots with 700+ hours and multiple years of training. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, reported after Midway, "Our losses in aircraft are severe but acceptable. Our losses in pilots are catastrophic. These men represented 5 years of training. We cannot replace their experience." He was exactly right. Japan's training infrastructure could graduate new pilots, but it couldn't create experience. And the American strategy, whether intentional or not, was about to exploit this weakness systematically. The Solomon Islands campaign, from August 1942 through February 1943, became a meat grinder for Japanese aviators. Daily raids from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles each way over open ocean, drained Japan's pilot pool with brutal efficiency. Japanese pilots flew 2 to 3 missions daily when operations allowed. No rotation policy existed. Pilots flew until death, injury, or total exhaustion. The best pilots accumulated missions rapidly, which meant they died or wore out rapidly. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai was shot through the head over Guadalcanal in August 1942, survived the 600-mile flight back to Rabaul, and was permanently removed from combat operations with severe injuries. Japan lost not just a pilot, but an irreplaceable combat instructor. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, one of Japan's top aces, was killed over Guadalcanal in October 1942 with 19 victories. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takatsugu Jojima, 16 victories, was killed in November. Flight Petty Officer Toshiaki Honda, 13 victories, died in January 1943. The statistics were devastating. Between August 1942 and February 1943, Japan lost approximately 900 aircraft and over 800 pilots in the Solomons campaign. The aircraft could be replaced. Japan's factories were still producing hundreds monthly. The pilots could not. By early 1943, Japanese Training Command faced an impossible situation. The operational forces were screaming for replacement pilots. But producing pilots with 700+ hours of training took 3 years. The war wasn't going to wait 3 years. The inevitable decision was made: reduce training standards to increase output. In March 1943, the Japanese Naval Aviation Training Program was compressed from 3 years to 18 months. Flight hours were reduced from 700 to approximately 500 hours before operational assignment. Advanced training was shortened. Gunnery practice was limited to conserve ammunition. Navigation training was abbreviated. This produced pilots who were adequate but not excellent, and it still took 18 months, meaning pilots entering training in March 1943 wouldn't reach operational units until September 1944. Japan needed pilots now, so standards dropped further. By late 1943, pilots were graduating with 300 to 400 total hours. By 1944, some reached operational units with less than 200 hours. By 1945, pilots were being sent to combat with as little as 100 hours of total flight time, less than a third of what their predecessors had received. The quality differential became obvious immediately. These poorly trained pilots couldn't navigate reliably over open ocean. Their gunnery was mediocre. Carrier landings, the most difficult aviation skill, were barely adequate in perfect conditions and disastrous in combat situations. Worse, Japan lost its experienced instructor cadre. The best pilots were needed at the front, not in training schools. So inexperienced instructors taught inadequate techniques to overwhelm students who graduated unprepared for what they'd face. While Japanese training collapsed, American training infrastructure hit full stride. By 1943, the United States was graduating approximately 100,000 military pilots annually across all services, nearly 2,000 per week. This included Army Air Forces pilots, Navy carrier pilots, Marine Corps aviation, and ferry command pilots. The Navy alone was producing 2,500 carrier-qualified pilots annually by 1943, increasing to 3,500 in 1944. These weren't poorly trained replacements. They were receiving the full 500 to 600-hour training program, just in far greater numbers. Training quality actually improved as infrastructure expanded. More aircraft meant more flight hours per student. More instructors, including combat veterans rotating back, meant better tactical training. Standardized curricula meant consistent quality across all training bases. The U.S. Navy implemented a rotation policy that Japan never matched. After 24 to 36 months of combat operations, experienced pilots were rotated back to training commands as instructors. This accomplished multiple objectives. It gave combat veterans a break, it brought current tactical knowledge to training programs, and it created a sustainable system where institutional knowledge was preserved. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, America's first naval aviation ace, became a training officer in 1943, passing his combat experience to hundreds of new pilots before returning to combat where he was killed. His knowledge lived on through the pilots he trained. This created a virtuous cycle. Combat veterans trained new pilots who became combat veterans who trained newer pilots. Each generation learned from the previous one. Japanese pilots by 1944 had no such advantage. Their instructors had never seen combat. The infrastructure scale was staggering. At Naval Air Station Pensacola alone, over 1,100 aircraft were dedicated to flight training. Students flew multiple times daily. Fuel consumption for training exceeded what the entire Japanese military aviation used monthly. But the most important difference was the expectation that not every pilot would be elite, and that was acceptable. American doctrine acknowledged that 20% of pilots would account for 80% of kills. The other 80% needed to be competent enough to survive, follow orders, and occasionally get lucky. This good enough standard allowed mass production that Japan's perfectionist culture couldn't match. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th, 20th, 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of pilot quality that had occurred in just 30 months. Japan launched approximately 373 aircraft from its carrier force against the American Fifth Fleet. These aircraft were met by approximately 450 American fighters from Task Force 58's carriers. What followed was systematic slaughter. American pilots, most with 500+ hours of training and 6 to 12 months of combat experience, faced Japanese pilots with 200 to 300 hours total time and often zero combat experience. It wasn't a battle. It was target practice. The Japanese attack waves showed signs of inadequate training immediately. Formations were loose and poorly coordinated. Navigation was imprecise. Several attack groups never found the American fleet. Those that did find targets approached in ways that indicated poor tactical training. American fighter pilots couldn't believe what they were facing. Lieutenant Commander Alex Varayu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, describing them as like shooting sitting ducks. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 eventual kills, shot down 9 aircraft in a single mission during this battle. His after-action report was telling. The enemy pilots showed no tactical sense. They flew straight and level, made no evasive maneuvers, and seemed genuinely surprised when attacked. It was like fighting students rather than warriors. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched, approximately 330 were shot down, an 88% loss rate. American losses, 29 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than combat. The kill ratio was over 11-1. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier force, couldn't comprehend what happened. Our pilots reported hitting multiple American carriers, he stated, confused why American operations continued unimpeded. How can this be? The answer was simple. His poorly trained pilots had missed their targets, then been shot down before returning to report their failures. The few who made it back exaggerated their successes to avoid shame. American pilots coined the term Great Marianas Turkey Shoot to describe the battle. It was darkly appropriate. The Japanese pilots had no more chance than farm turkeys on slaughter day. The disparity widened further as 1944 progressed. By late 1944, American pilots reaching operational squadrons often had 600 to 800 total flight hours. Many had logged more training time than Japanese pilots had total flying time. The American system had refined itself to the point where new pilots arrived at combat squadrons already familiar with their aircraft type, tactical doctrine, and enemy capabilities. They'd practiced against aggressor pilots flying captured Japanese aircraft. They knew Japanese tactics better than Japanese pilots knew American tactics. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training had deteriorated to crisis levels. By October 1944, pilots were reaching operational units with 100 to 150 hours total time. Some had never flown their assigned aircraft type before joining their squadron. Navigation training was so abbreviated that pilots couldn't reliably find their way back to carriers after missions. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kiyoshi Ogawa, who would later die as a kamikaze pilot, wrote in his diary in September 1944, "I have 120 hours total flight time. The Americans we face have 500 or more. Our instructors told us to rely on spirit and courage. Spirit cannot overcome bullets when you cannot aim properly. Courage cannot help when you cannot navigate home." The kill ratios reflected this disparity. In battles during late 1944, American pilots were achieving kill ratios of 15-1, 20-1. sometimes higher. Japanese losses in a single day's operations could exceed 50 aircraft with corresponding pilot casualties, while Americans lost 2 to 3 aircraft. The mathematics were unsustainable. Japan was losing pilots far faster than training could replace them, and replacements were progressively less capable, meaning loss rates accelerated. By late 1944, Japanese commanders faced a brutal reality. Their pilots couldn't survive long enough to gain combat experience. A new pilot might fly 3 to 5 missions before being killed. This meant the pilot force was perpetually inexperienced, facing increasingly experienced American pilots. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi recognized this death spiral. In October 1944, he formed the first kamikaze units. The logic was coldly rational. If pilots couldn't survive multiple missions anyway, and if their training was too poor for accurate attacks, then one-lay suicide missions that only required flying into targets might achieve more than conventional attacks. Kamikaze tactics were an admission of training failure. Japan couldn't produce pilots capable of attacking and surviving, so they designed tactics that only required attacking. The program's official name was Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogetai, Divine Wind Special Attack Unit. Pilots received minimal training, just enough to take off, navigate to target areas, and dive into ships. Total training time for kamikaze pilots averaged 60 to 100 hours. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi, assigned to a kamikaze unit in January 1945, described the training in letters home. We practiced takeoffs and basic flight for 2 weeks, then navigation for 1 week. Then we are told we are ready. I have 70 hours of flight time. In my father's war, pilots had 700 hours before combat. But there is no time. There are no resources. There is only honor in death. Over 3,800 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks between October 1944 and August 1945. They sank approximately 47 Allied vessels and damaged over 300 more. But this represented using pilots as guided missiles, the complete opposite of the elite aviation force Japan had possessed in 1941. American pilot losses continued, but the differential remained overwhelming. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps lost approximately 1,500 pilots in combat during 1944 to 45. But these were being replaced by better trained pilots from a training infrastructure that kept improving. By war's end in August 1945, American training programs had produced over 430,000 military pilots total during the war. Japan had produced approximately 25,000 naval aviators and perhaps 40,000 total military pilots across all services. More significantly, American pilot losses were roughly 35,000 killed, a 8% fatality rate. Japanese losses exceeded 55,000 pilots killed, nearly 85% of all pilots trained during the war. This difference reflected not just combat outcomes, but training quality. Better trained pilots survived at higher rates. The experience differential by war's end was staggering. American squadrons included pilots with 1,000-plus flight hours and 100-plus combat missions. Japanese squadrons included teenagers with 60 hours of flight time on their first and often final mission. The final air battles over Japan in July-August 1945 showed the complete collapse. American pilots flew with virtual impunity, shooting down dozens of Japanese aircraft for minimal losses. Japanese pilots, many in their first week of operational service, died without ever understanding what killed them. The parallel to every other American victory story is clear. industrial-scale production defeated artisan quality. Like the Sherman tank, overwhelming Panthers through numbers. Like sonar-equipped destroyers, drowning U-boats. Like Enigma code-breaking, exposing German plans. American systematic advantages made individual quality irrelevant. Japan trained better individual pilots in 1941. America built a better pilot training system that produced adequate pilots in overwhelming numbers, then kept them alive long enough to become excellent. Commander Saburo Sakai, one of the few elite Japanese pilots who survived the war, reflected in 1957. In 1941, one Japanese pilot was worth 10 Americans. By 1943, we were equal. By 1944, 10 Americans were worth one Japanese pilot. This wasn't because we became cowardly or because Americans became supermen. It was because they created a system that built and preserved pilot quality. We had a culture that created individual excellence, but couldn't sustain it under war's pressures. The numbers tell the story. In December 1941, the average Japanese carrier pilot had 700 hours of flight time. The average American carrier pilot had 300 hours. By June 1944, the average Japanese carrier pilot had 200 hours. The average American had 600 hours. Quality had completely reversed, and with it, the war's outcome in the air became mathematically certain. If this story of how systematic training defeated individual excellence surprised you, you need to see our other videos revealing how American industrial thinking won World War II. We've got dozens more stories. The technologies, training systems, and production methods that defeated Axis powers who believed in individual superiority over systematic advantages. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. We release new videos every week showing the real reasons America won. Not just battlefield courage, but systematic thinking applied to every aspect of warfare. Comment below, what shocked you most? That Japanese pilots went from 700 hours to 100 hours of training? That kamikaze tactics were an admission of training failure? That America produced 430,000 pilots, while Japan produced 40,000. Subscribe to War Rewind, where we show you how systems defeated excellence every single time. See you in the next video.